Hi, Roisin. I think we can kick off now, if that's okay.
Great, thanks, Stephen. Good morning, everyone. My name is Roisin Clark, and I would like to welcome you all here today for the launch of the Mental Health Act Toolkit. Mental Health Reform has partnered with the School of Law, University College Cork, to develop this toolkit over the last number of months, and this was enabled by funding provided by the Irish Research Council. By way of background, Mental Health Reform is Ireland's leading national coalition on mental health. Our vision is of an Ireland where people can access the support they need in their community to achieve their best possible mental health. In line with this vision, we drive the progressive reform of mental health services and supports, and we do that through coordination and policy development, research and innovation, accountability and collective advocacy. With 80 member organisations and thousands of individual supporters, mental health reform provides a unified voice to government, its agencies, the Oireachtas, and the public on mental health issues. The Mental Health Act Toolkit we're sharing with you today has been drafted in consultation with mental health reform's member organisations through a series of online and in-person consultation meetings. The meetings were attended by a wide variety of people, including people with lived experience of mental health difficulties, family members, supporters, and staff. When people with mental health difficulties are admitted to mental health units, either on a voluntary or involuntary basis, it's crucial that user-friendly, accessible information is available to them regarding their rights. We hope this toolkit will be a vital means of empowerment. It will enable people to know and understand their rights so that they can be exercised and claimed. This importantly aligns with attaining a fuller realisation of our rights as provided for not only by the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the UN CRPD, but indeed our own Irish Constitution. We have a busy agenda for you this morning at the launch, and we will be joined from UCC by the Mental Health Act Toolkit researcher, Dr. Darius Whelan, and research assistant, Claire Carroll. Our mental health reform coordinator for the project, Bear Grogan, will provide us with important information on human rights in the context of mental health. And I'm very pleased that we'll have the opportunity to speak with Sinead McDermott, family peer support worker, who will talk to us about her experience of the Mental Health Act from a family member's perspective. I'm afraid we won't have time for a full Q&A during the session, but we will provide contact emails at the end for both Mental Health Reform and UCC. The chat function is available, however, and comments are welcome. But before we move on, please remember, if you need help, support is available. You can visit our members page on mentalhealthreform.ie, where you'll find a list of organisations offering mental health supports across Ireland. You'll also find information regarding mental health services and helplines on the HSE Your Mental Health webpage. But if you'd like to talk to someone now, you can text hello to 50808 to start a conversation, or you can call Samaritans on 116 123, and both are free and confidential services. So without any further delay, thank you again for joining us this morning for the launch of the Mental Health Act Toolkit. I'll hand over now to Dr. Darius Whelan and Claire Carroll of the School of Law, UCC, who will tell us more about the development of the toolkit. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Roisin, and welcome everybody. Claire and I have divided up the slides for this presentation, and so I'll hand over to Claire to begin with the first set of slides.
Thanks, Darius, and good morning, everyone. It's lovely to be with you here today for the launch of the toolkit. So really, I'm going to give you a sense this morning of the why and the how of the toolkit, really. So the rationale of the toolkit design and how we went about developing the toolkit. So I hope you can all hear me well. Am I okay? Am I audible, Darius? Great. Yep. Good. Okay, so just in terms of background, I suppose internationally and nationally, there is an increased emphasis on the importance and value of engaged research. And engaged research really is the idea that universities should work hand in hand with the communities that they're situated in and should make links with voluntary sector and public sector bodies. And accordingly, the Irish Research Council has developed a new foundations grant scheme where it provides funding for collaborative projects between university researchers and civil society groups in the community and voluntary sector. So it's against this background really that the Mental Health Toolkit was designed and came about. In essence, it's a collaboration between UCC, School of Law and Mental Health Reform, and generously funded by the Irish Research Council. So move on to the next slide then. Thanks, Darius. So why a mental health toolkit? Well, as Roisin mentioned at the outset, the spirit of this toolkit is really one of empowerment. It provides information so that you're empowered to claim your rights. And the aim of the toolkit, the intention is that you will know the main sources of human rights and law, understand your rights and how to use your rights when receiving care under mental health laws, understand professional standards, and if service providers fall short of those standards, how to make complaints, and last but certainly not least, identify advocacy services available to you and also other ways to raise your voice. Next slide. So according to the spirit of empowerment, the toolkit can also be used as a really good kind of launch pad or springboard for your own research process. So you'll see throughout the toolkit that it provides information to other existing resources because there is so much information out there. So examples of the kinds of external resources that we highlight and that are hyperlinked in the document are resources of the Mental Health Commission, Mental Health Reform, the HSE, and of course the Irish Statute Book, where you'll find Irish laws. Next slide. Moving on then to the how this toolkit was developed. As mentioned at the outset, it really was a collaborative process. It was a partnership between UCC School of Law, Darius Whelan was the principal investigator, and myself, Ger Carroll, I was the research assistant. And on mental health reform side, Ber Grogan was kindly coordinating all of our events and stakeholder consultation in particular. And ethical approval was attained at the outset by UCC Social Research Ethics Committee. Next slide. So throughout, I suppose the main focus and what really sets this toolkit apart is the strong dialogue that was developed throughout the process. So myself and Darius on the UCC side developed a draft outline of the toolkit and draft expanded text, and it was really the consultation meetings that brought that draft to life. We developed by those meetings with stakeholders a really strong sense of what might be valuable to people in a toolkit like this. So this is a picture of our lovely selves at an in-person event in Maynooth in July. We had one in-person event. And on that day, we met with people with lived experience of mental health difficulties and their supporters, and we heard their views on what might work in a toolkit. Next slide, please. But the bulk of our consultation process actually took place online. It's the joy of a virtual world that we live in now. It was very accessible and workable for people. So over the course of the summer from June to August inclusive, we worked with mental health reform member organisations and the grassroots forum. We also met with the European Mental Health NGOs and Irish Mental Health Lawyers Association. Next slide. Accordingly, I suppose by virtue, as you can imagine, by virtue of those meetings, the toolkit really came to life, and it was very much enriched and became much more realistic as well. So we really would like to thank myself and Darius, everyone who took part in the consultation and made the toolkit what it is today. We'd like to extend a special thanks to mental health reform member organisations, the Mental Health Reform Grassroots Forum, the staff of Mental Health Reform, who gave a great deal of time to this project amidst an already packed agenda, especially Roisin Clark, Ber Grogan, Niamh O'Connor, Stephen Shields, Susanna Weedle, and Julia Corey, and of course, we'd also like to acknowledge the generous funding of the Irish Research Council, UCC School of Law for your support, and last but certainly not least, our design team, Fox and Mouse, whose graphics have really brought the toolkit to life. So I'm now going to hand you over to Darius, and Darius will be looking more at the content of the toolkit in more detail.
Thank you, Claire. So there are three outputs of this funded project. The first is the online toolkit itself, which is about 40 pages long. We also have a brief printed brochure about the toolkit, and I have it here. It has arrived. It does exist. So rather than printing the whole toolkit out, the intention is to distribute the brochure, which highlights the toolkit, through member organizations of mental health reform. We also are writing an academic article about the toolkit project, and the toolkit will be available at the website given there, which is the same website which was linked in your invitation emails. The scope of the toolkit is that it concerns the law as it is now, and it doesn't deal in any way with proposed changes. It refers briefly to the fact that there are proposed changes, but we decided in order to make it manageable, we would just deal with the law as it is now. We also decided only to deal with adults rather than children, because there are so many separate rules about children, it would have become perhaps confusing. We also don't deal with areas such as wards of court, powers of attorney, and the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act. We do hope to provide updated online versions when the law changes. So as many of you will know, there are concrete proposals to reform the mental health acts, but for the moment, the law is as it is, and we will review whether we can produce an updated version when the law changes, when that actually happens. We also do recognize that sometimes the toolkit will not be or may not be available to a person if they don't have internet access. That is a limitation which we're very much aware of. And a further limitation is that a person, because they're having mental health difficulties at a particular time, may not be in a position to engage in detail with the toolkit at that time. In those scenarios, sometimes their family or supporters may be able to engage with it and assist them to know their rights. And in the remaining slides of this presentation, I have 15 screenshots of the toolkit, just to give you an idea of the features of the toolkit. The purpose of these is not for you to look at the content as such, because that you can do after the launch, but just to highlight some features. And so I'll only briefly show each screenshot. So the first one is the table of contents, just to give you an idea that we have 4 sections in the toolkit. Firstly, about the toolkit, explaining the nature of the toolkit. Secondly, a section on human rights. Thirdly, the mental health acts. And so that's the main body of the toolkit. It's the longest section. And then fourthly, a section on complaints, advocacy, and activism. So in section 1 then, just to give you a few quick examples of the content there, we have 2 important notes. One is about the use of language in the toolkit. We explain that we use the legal language, even though the legal language is sometimes stigmatizing. And indeed, there are proposals to change the language in the future. So we thought it was important to highlight that for people. A second important note that we have at the beginning is that we explain the differences between the different sources of law and codes of practice. So we explain the differences between acts and rules and so on as they are used in the toolkit. Then in section 2, on the human rights section, I've just included a quick screenshot there, which shows that we explain the various rights which are relevant. And this is just an extract. There are other rights dealt with in section 2 as well. And it's an important part of empowering people that they become aware of the classifications which the law uses regarding human rights and constitutional rights in mental health. Moving on then to section 3, which is the largest section on the Mental Health Acts. We explained, for example, that the term mental disorder is the legal definition used in the Mental Health Acts, and we explain how that legal definition differs from other terms which people will come across in discussing mental health issues. And we then, of course, explain the exact legal definition in the Mental Health Acts and provide a link to the full text of the acts for people. We include information about advanced health care directives, which are becoming more significant with the imminent commencement of the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act. And we feel it's important that they be mentioned very early on in the document because there's something that a person might need to consider early on in their journey through the mental health system. We talk about the significant role of supporters in mental health care. And by supporters, we mean either family members or other friends or supporters which a person may wish to have involved in their care. We move on then to talk about what are called the approved centre regulations, which apply to all of the approved centres, which are mental health units where people may be involved in residential care under the Mental Health Acts. And so we tried to lay out in a tabular form and in an accessible form the regulations in the approved centre regulations. We then talk about the different rights which apply to what are called voluntary patients under the legislation. And later we talk about the rights of involuntary patients under the legislation. And we feel that it's very important to highlight for people the differences between the rights for those two categories of service users. From time to time, we use scenarios to illustrate the application of the legislation. And in order to make the legislation accessible and understandable to a person for whom all of this terminology may be very new. And so this is an example of one of those scenarios about the role of the Garda Síochána in emergencies under the Mental Health Acts. We move on then to talk about mental health tribunals, which apply in situations where a person is involuntarily admitted under the Mental Health Acts. As many people will know, these are 3-member independent tribunals which assess and review a person's admission under the Mental Health Acts. And finally then in section 4, we deal with complaints, advocacy and activism. We feel it's very important in a toolkit to provide people with concrete information about how they can make a complaint or access advocacy services. And in that section, we also provide a template complaint. As it says there at the top of the page, below we show the text of a general complaint. And one of the things we're highlighting for people here is that if you are making a complaint, it can be very useful to highlight the standards which the relevant professional should have been following, or the relevant institution should have been following, and to highlight how the conduct in question did not comply with those standards. So one of the questions people may well have is, what is a toolkit as opposed to anything else? And the idea of the use of the word toolkit is that it provides tangible tools for people, tangible information, and calls to action, if you like, methods of taking action. And that's why we chose the term toolkit as the title for the document. Also in section 4, we do highlight advocacy services. We also highlight them earlier on in the document as well, because one of the items of feedback we received was that advocacy services should not be left just towards the end of the document, that very early on in a person's journey through the mental health services, it could be helpful to refer to advocacy services. So we refer to them earlier on in the document as well. So that concludes my very much whistle-stop tour through the document. I do hope you have a chance to look at the full toolkit later on today, and I encourage you to share it widely if you find it useful. And I'll now stop sharing. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Darius and Claire, and that was wonderful. And we really appreciate all of your work in creating this very important resource. If you have any questions regarding the toolkit, we will make an email available to you later on in the session, and you can send your questions directly to Darius. So I think the important role that the toolkit will play in providing accessible, clear and understandable information that will empower and inform people, it can't be overstated. So thank you both for your work. I have no doubt that it will assist many. Thank you. So now I'm delighted to introduce Bear Grogan, Policy and Research Manager, Mental Health Reform. Bear, as you know, is our project coordinator for the Mental Health Act Toolkit project and worked closely with Darius and Claire on developing the toolkit. Bear will tell us more about human rights and mental health. Thanks, Bear.
Thanks, Emil, Roisin. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Yeah, I'm going to set my timer because if any of you have seen me at meetings before, you know I can tend to go on a bit. So, and I don't want to take up more time than I'm supposed to. Just to start off with saying, I know I'm the named coordinator, but it was very, very much a team effort from mental health reform. And, you know, Stephen is there in the background as well, clicking through the slides and pulling through the slides, and Niamh, and as Claire and Darius mentioned, Susanna and Julia and Roisin. So even though I'm the named coordinator on the project, very, very much a team effort, and an absolute pleasure to work with Darius and Claire. So I have 10 minutes that I'm going to fly through some stuff about human rights and the Mental Health Act as it stands now, and I will touch a bit on, as Darius said, about the reform of the Mental Health Act that is upcoming, and then be handing over to Roisin again to talk about to talk with Sinead. So so I'll go on to the first point there about apologies now if this is set at a point that you already know all of this information, but there's a wide variety of people attending this morning. So just want to kind of give that the whistle-stop tour of all of the pieces. So our national mental health policy is sharing the vision, and this has been in place since June 2020. So there's an implementation plan, there's action plans, there's a monitoring committee, which is something that its predecessor, A Vision for Change, maybe kind of fell down on the actual implementation of the policies. But the new vision is very well set up for the action plans implementation, and there's great timelines in there as well that we can hold the government to account on their commitments. So we'll go on to the next slide then. Just to say, at the moment, the Mental Health Act is very much about the best interests of the person. And obviously that is changing now with the Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act and with the reform of the Mental Health Acts. You know, we are moving towards a much more person-centred, human rights compliant, you know, looking at the will and preferences of the person's involvement in their care, and kind of moving away from the paternalistic system of best interests of, you know, the medical profession know best of what you should be doing. But even within this, it does talk about the person's right to dignity, bodily integrity, privacy and autonomy. So it's not like we have to wait until the reform of the Mental Health Act before we start talking about human rights. We have human rights now. And I came across this on HICWA has a really great slide deck on human rights and the social and healthcare sectors. So in a survey that was done in 2018, I just thought this was a really interesting snapshot of kind of what people think of when they hear the term human rights. But I'm going to go on to the next slide. and talk about the principles. So, and just to say, I know I'm flying through this, and I'm very happy to make myself available afterwards to talk through any of this in more detail with anyone. But I think what Darius and Claire have managed to do is take really dense legislation and codes of practice and guidelines and make it into an accessible and really clear information format, which is no easy task at all. And the thing that HIQA, the Health Information Quality Authority, on their human rights slide deck, they have so it's the FREEDIC principles. And I think sometimes we can get caught up in the technicalities of the legislation, and it can be really confusing. And at the end of the day, it is about focusing on the person and their human rights. And this can be a useful principle. So fairness, respect, equality, dignity, and autonomy. And a lot of the time as well, it's about empathy and compassion and putting yourself in the person's shoes. If you are the person receiving the mental health care, supports, treatment, whether if you're voluntary, involuntary, how would you want to be treated? How would you want to be listened to? How would you want to be involved? And I think Frida, that can be a handy principle to think of, and it forms the basics of good care, and it's about the day-to-day work. Obviously the legislation is there, but it's how that translates into the day-to-day work, and the toolkit is going to be a really great tool to inform people about their rights. So we can't talk about human rights and mental health without mentioning the UN CRPD, so the UN Convention on Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and Roisin mentioned this already. Thank you, Stephen. You're already ahead of me now with this. This is great. This is why MHR is such a brilliant team. People might not choose to identify as disabled. So if you have enduring mental health difficulties, or your mental health difficulties impact your life, or are barriers to employment or secure housing, you may not want to identify with a diagnosis, and that's completely fine. You may not want to identify as disabled, and that's completely fine. In sharing the vision, the policy, the terminology used is mental health difficulties, whereas in the UN CRPD, in the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the terminology used is psychosocial disability. And that includes people who have lived experience of mental health difficulties, or who self-identify with this term. And the bottom line on the kind of terminology and the labels and things like that is that we all have rights. We have rights under our Equal Status Acts, we have rights under the UN CRPD, we have human rights. And that is that's the message to just really hit home with today. So I'm actually going to fly through a couple of these. So it's the mission of the UN CRPD that we have full equality under the law. And then the next point there that I just want to touch a little bit about. When I started in MHR just over a year ago, I was at a presentation with Fiona, and she did these 2 slides, and it just really helped put things in context for me. So when we're looking at the different models of disability, when I say they're charity, medical, social, and human rights, charity is not referencing charities. There are a lot of absolutely amazing charities in the community and voluntary sector who are providing vital services. And as you heard earlier, we have our 80 members. But so it's a charity model of disability. So in the next slide, it's going to give us the examples of the models in practice. So if we look at a woman with a diagnosis of schizophrenia who's qualified as a mechanic. So historically, it was the charity model that was very kind of overrepresented in with mental health difficulties and in the mental health sector. So the thought process would have been around, oh, well, she'll never be able to find work. Maybe we'll get her a place in a sheltered work setting as a cleaner. So very much, we'll make the decisions, not consulting with the person, not thinking about what the person wants, and just, very much kind of that paternalistic and maybe, even patronizing kind of model of practice. And again, that's not to say that this is what the charities do. It's definitely not. It's absolutely not. But it's that model of disability. Whereas the medical model, again, something that continues to be very overrepresented in our mental health sector and services is that, well, she'll need to be on medication long term, and that could impact on her ability to work as a mechanic, and very much just focusing on the medical model and medication as a main form of treatment. Whereas thankfully now with the UNCRPD and just moving on globally in understandings about mental health and disabilities, we've moved towards the social model and the rights-based model. So the social model would say it's necessary to educate and change employer attitudes so they can provide accommodation necessary for people to pursue their chosen profession. And then the rights-based model goes even further to say discriminatory attitudes of employers must be prohibited by law and must be sanctioned when they occur, that this woman has a right to employment on an equal basis with others and to have reasonable accommodations made in her workplace. And just a note on the word accommodation here in the social model and the rights-based model, we're not, when we're talking about accommodation and reasonable accommodations, we're not talking about housing or you know, that kind of like a building or setting of accommodation. Reasonable accommodations are things that can be put in place by employers that will make a workplace more accessible for persons with disabilities. So for example, with a physical disability, that could be about having a ramp. You know, with mental health difficulties and psychosocial disabilities, it could be about having employee assistance programs and access to talk therapies. Sorry, you see, this is why I had to set my timer, because I'm too I talk too much. So that's just to say about the accommodation. And the optional protocol is a way that we can hold the government to account, and also, you know, the complaints mechanisms of if we're looking at reasonable accommodations that haven't been made to help us get access to workplace or training. It hasn't been ratified. It absolutely should be ratified. There's no excuse for delay. And actually there's an Oireachtas committee discussing the optional protocol today. So I'll just jump on to the next one. The gaps in the reform of the Mental Health Act. This is something that we do a lot of work on in mental health reform. We actually have a human rights analysis on our website. And that goes into a lot of detail about the kind of the legal analysis and the human rights analysis of the proposed reform. And the reform is great. There are a couple of things that we would like to see changed and strengthened, such as the right to advocacy and independent complaints mechanism, right to community care. And then just to jump on to the next one then. So with as well as the toolkit, which is the toolkit for now and the law as it stands now, we also have short guides and video explainers about the UNCRPD. We have some training videos up on the UNCRPD part of the website. We have a talk to your TD briefing note, which was done by Susanna in the office for budget 2023, but this can be applied across the board. We need to get mental health on the political agenda. We need to be talking about the reforms needed in the Mental Health Act. We need to be talking about human rights and mental health. And unless the TDs are hearing it and the senators and the councillors are hearing it coming up on the doors, it might not necessarily be given the priority that it should. So there's also a link there as well that you can find out who your local TD is and get onto them with phone calls and visiting their constituency offices, writing to them, emails, you know, and putting mental health on the political agenda, because it's long overdue that we have reform. And this toolkit is going to give us a really good basis to say, this is where we are at the moment. These are the changes that we want. And we really hope that in mental health reform, you'll keep in touch with us to help us advocate for much needed change. So I'm going to hand over now to Roisin. I hope I didn't go too much over time. Really looking forward to hearing Roisin and Sinead.
Thank you so much. An incredible amount of information there in record time. So well done. And really important information to have the context on human rights and mental health. And I appreciate the reminder in there for us all, the person, their will and preference and their rights remain at the centre of everything. So as Bear said, there's plenty of information and resources available on our website. So please, you can visit us there and learn more. So now I'm delighted to welcome Sinead McDermott, who is very kindly going to share her experience and insight of the Mental Health Act from a family member's perspective. Sinead is a family peer support worker in the Roscommon East Galway region and is one of the main trustees in Roscommon Mental Health Association with a passion for family recovery. She works closely with Regari Recovery College in Roscommon, and she co-facilitates many of the family modules there. She's also involved in many community organisations in the county, and has recently co-produced a directory of services for County Roscommon and a family member resource booklet for the county as well. Sinead is qualified in peer support from Dublin City University and holds an international certificate in intentional peer support. She is in fact now one of the first international intentional peer support trainers in Ireland. Sinead, delighted to have you here with us today. Thank you so much. A busy schedule, I'm sure you have. How are you?
I'm good, and I'm delighted to be here, and it's really interesting. I'm learning loads here as well from everybody, and I'm delighted that the toolkit is here because it's so important.
Fantastic, Sinead. Thank you. So Sinead, as a family peer support worker, you help families who have loved ones engaging with mental health services, but you yourself also have first-hand experience as a family member supporting your mother who has lived experience of mental health difficulties. Can you talk to us a bit about your experience as a family member and how it led you to become a peer support worker?
Of course. I'd like to say firstly, I suppose as a family member, I was coming from a place of not knowing anything about human rights, toolkits. I didn't know what a social worker was. I didn't know anything about the mental health system, like many other family members do, and that can cause a lot of frustration and anxiety and trauma in itself. And so just to highlight, when I am talking, I am coming from a place of not knowing. So I had the experience, I suppose, of looking at the Act in 1945 and then changing over to 2001. So I would have been about 13 years old when my mum first had mental health challenges, and I really didn't know what was going on. I was an only child, so myself and my dad were there, and she began to hear voices. Things went downhill. She didn't know what was going on. We didn't know what was going on. We didn't know what was happening. We didn't know what services to access. We didn't know anything about human rights, where to go. So I suppose our protocol was firstly the GP, and it took a long time to get the services that we needed, but thankfully we did eventually. But it was a very scary process, and from that moment that she had accessed the adult mental health unit, the doors were closed for the family members. We didn't know what was going on. I remember as a child seeing these brown doors shut, my mum taken away, and myself and my dad standing there. We didn't know what was happening, and we were so lucky at the time that an A&E nurse that had a family member, she was a family member that had went through it as well, had followed us down, and all she did was hold my dad's hand and give me a hug and say, it's going to be okay, everything is going to be fine. And that's the only thing from that day that I really remember as a family member, just looking, going, okay, it's going to be okay, because that's all we needed. We just needed that bit to say it's going to be okay. Since then, she was okay. You know, she did improve, and you know, the services were there for her, and they really supported her really well. And she was discharged, and she went into a really good part of recovery. And she didn't really understand what was happening either. And like that, the toolkit is so important for her to understand it too, and to have the whole family approach in that as well, so that we could all understand it would be ideal. But a couple of years later, I suppose the Act did change, and as a family member, it got really harder for myself and my dad, in our instance, to access mental health services. We really didn't know what was happening then. We had no idea about human rights or what was going on, only please help our family member and do something for her. And it came to the stage where at about 21, I had to sign my mum in because my dad wasn't able, and there was nobody else there. And the trauma of that myself, and even losing the power in my legs that day, watching my mum being carried away, was really hard. And I didn't understand it. I didn't understand what was happening. And I suppose looking at that, I suppose the family member and my mental health wasn't in a good state then, if you're looking at it as a process and a system. So really the education of how to access services in the best way was key for us. But I suppose my journey in that, it ignited a part where I wanted education, and I wanted to learn more on how to access mental health services in the best way for everyone. And that led me into mental health Roscommon, and roles came up in family peer support. I didn't know what they were. And it was a journey for me. And when I heard about the family peer support role, which is supporting family members that have somebody accessing mental health services, I thought of that nurse. And all she did was one small thing, is hold hope for us. And that was enough to get us through. And it ignited a huge journey for me in my learning. So that's where I'm at, and I wanted to train more. I want to learn more. I want to help family members understand, and I think supports in that are vital, like the family peer support. And there's so many initiatives out there for family members, but it's just to access them is key, and to learn about them and have that information so widely available for them. And just to finish off that story, my mum is 10 years in a really good recovery. And our relationship since that, she supported me. I mean, we all have mental health and it all goes up and down, and her knowledge of the mental health services and getting the right supports has really helped my journey and helped my dad's, and she's been able to help others in to know community peer support. So it really has come full circle, and that was because of education, and that's from knowledge and being able to move forward together.
Sinead, I'm delighted to hear your mum is doing well, and it's an incredible story how you've taken those challenges and turned them around, seeking to help other people. I'm very struck by the long-standing impact that one nurse had on you. Yeah. And the comfort you took from that. And I think that's a really important point, isn't it? It can be one good person to reach out and to hold a hand can make such a difference. Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah. It amazes me every day, because I know that when I talk to family members and they go, my God, you know, they notice the little things where I think I haven't helped somebody, they see that impact. And I just remember that nurse, and you remember your story, that really we don't know what's going on as family members, and it can be really frustrating.
Absolutely, and frightening. So I think it's a really good reminder, isn't it? It's the little things that count, and it just reaching out to somebody can really have such a long-standing impact. So Sinead, the Mental Health Act, as you know, is a vital piece of legislation, and we all know it can be difficult to navigate. Can you tell us a little bit more about your own experience in navigating the Act itself as a family member?
As a family member, I found it really challenging. I didn't understand it. I didn't understand human rights. When you're really coming at that level, when somebody is really unwell and you can visually see it, it's really hard to look at human rights and to look at all that and understand it. Now, coming from a place from doing the education and having these wonderful resources, I do get it. And you know, the Mental Health Act, a knock-on effect, has saved my life in my own instances in domestic violence and different cases. It has saved people, and it's needed, and it's vital to have that to support people and their human rights. But at the same time, it has to be understood by family members, or it's really hard to move forward. And in their own recovery journey, family members need to step back and understand why these things are in place. But until you have that time and have that knowledge and easy accessible English, you can't do that.
You're absolutely right. And it's knowledge is power, isn't it, Sinead, really, to use an old one, if you will. But it really very much is. So in practical terms, how do you think the toolkit will support people, both with lived experience of mental health and indeed, you know, family members, friends and supporters, to understand and exercise their rights more in a very practical way?
Well, firstly, I think it'll really help family members, the toolkit, to help them step back and understand why things are in place. And understanding that can take away a lot of the scariness and the frustrations. It's just that little bit of knowledge, because when you really come from a place of not knowing, you can't only go, oh Jesus, will you just help me? You know, it's that frustration level in a family member. And for people accessing services to understand it themselves. I mean, my mum, if she understood the processes, which she did eventually, because she knows now in the comfort of the Mental Health Act that she can walk in, and if she's not feeling okay, she can talk about that and access the services that she needs without the fear that she will be involuntarily detained, which is a huge fear for people. And that, I think that's vital, to understand it and how to access these things in the right way, and know that you have the comfort that you're not going to be pulled into a system that you don't want to, and more holistic approach and person-centered approach for the whole family. I think it'll really, really help, and it'll make such an impact on both family members and people accessing services.
You're absolutely right. It is about the whole family unit, isn't it? And the ripple effect, and the supports need to be there for everybody that's involved. So in terms of family members and supporters who play such a valuable role in access to care and recovery, as you've shown, seeing a loved one go through a mental health difficulty is challenging. It's traumatic, as you said. Sinead, what advice from your experience would you give any supporters who might be watching here today?
I suppose know that you're not alone. There's a lot of us out there, and to be okay in that discomfort and that frustration, that you do feel that, and when you're coming from a place that you've no idea what's going on and you don't know what the future holds, it's okay to look for that support, and it's okay to step back. That's a huge thing. There's so many supports out there. It's hard to find them when you're looking for them. So all these different things like the directory of services, the toolkits, things being widely available online and in the community are vital. There are so many initiatives out there. So, get on to social workers, get on to GPs, ask for family peer support service, look for community supports like Shine. There's recovery colleges that are there for people accessing services and service users, family members, supporters. It's available for everyone. So it's to access them services and realize that there's so many of us there, and that you're not alone, and that it's okay to ask for help and supports.
It absolutely is, Sinead. Absolutely powerful words. You're an inspiration, I have to say, and honestly, for the incredible work that you do and all the help that you give people. Thank you very much. It's been such a pleasure to speak to you today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So it remains for me to bring the session to a close. And my thanks to everyone who has joined us here today, to all our speakers. And indeed, as you've heard, this was very much a collaborative project made possible by the input and contributions of many. So thank you all very much. The Mental Health Act Toolkit will be published on Mental Health Reform's website as well, and you can access it there. Please share it with your networks and with anyone that you think might benefit. And of course, as always, if you need help, and as Sinead has said, support is available. And you can visit our members webpage on mentalhealthreform.ie, where you'll find a list of organisations offering mental health supports all around Ireland. There's also information regarding mental health services and helplines on the HSE webpage, Your Mental Health. But if you'd like to talk to someone now, you can text hello to 50808, or you can call Samaritans on 116 123. And as I said, both are free and confidential services. If you have any questions about the Mental Health Act Toolkit or relating to the discussion today, you can contact either Mental Health Reform or Darius at the emails on screen. And please do visit our website, where you can sign up for our newsletter. You can learn more about our work and keep up to date. And of course, we're on all social media platforms. So thank you very much for joining us here today, and wishing you all the very best.